Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by Amanda Alley. Wendigo in my backyard. It was late night. My now boyfriend, I'll call him Jake, and I were getting ready to sleep in an acquaintance's playhouse in her backyard. The structure is about 5 by 8 with 3 windows and a fence directly next to one of the windows. The windows are large and close to the ground. Suddenly, I notice 2 shadowy figures through the cracks in the fence. I see what appears to be 2 people standing very close to the fence, about 1.5 feet away from the playhouse. This is near the alley. One is about 5 feet 9 inches and the other 5 feet 2 inches. No details were visible, just silhouettes. Fearing the cops were after him, Jake hides under the blanket and goes to sleep. I grab my knife and begin my vigil, because something told me that wasn't what was out there. Then, the scratching at the bottom of the wall begins. Whatever this was circled the playhouse and aggressively scratched, darn near constantly. It sounded like the size of a raccoon, but I could not, despite every effort, catch a glimpse. This was bizarre. I spent about 2 hours listening to this creature sometimes make slow circles, sometimes very quick. I heard it walk on the tiny porch. Meanwhile, the larger figures outside the fence move just enough to know they are alive, but never step away from where they were standing. At first, I was paralyzed with fear. This was until I figured that whatever this was, may well smell weakness. So I summoned up every ounce of the willpower I never knew I had. After a bit of wrestling with primal terror, I was calm and ready to fight. Although a bit angry at these fuckers that were invading my property, fence is offset from the alley so there is a nook of grass not visible from much elsewhere. The small creature walked over to the door and seemed to be pawing and sniffing, causing the hinges to rattle, desperately wanting to get to us for whatever reason. The way the window was angled, I should have been able to see it. The only gap in my sight was about the size of a rat. After living in a tent for some time, I know what rats sound like. This one would have to have been extremely rabid and raged out to maintain this loudness and not give up. We had no food or aromatic drinks. Rabid rats at that stage would tend to blunder, and this thing was doing anything but that. It was focused. Also, it didn't make any noise other than scratching. I would expect hissing, or at least an errant squeak. This continues for around an hour. Sometimes I move around and look out at weird angles trying to determine what the hell this is. Jake, lucky enough he is a heavy sleeper and was under a lot of blankets so didn't wake up. Later, the sounds got steadily louder and started expanding, for lack of a better word. That crescended in aggressive scratching completely surrounding the playhouse, all the walls and roof, from more points than I could count. Still able to see nothing. My psyche was on fire, but not with fear somehow. I accepted death. I became euphoric for a few minutes as I figured I should enjoy my last time on Earth. The blazing joy faded, but I remained calm and happy. The scratching calmed down, and after about half an hour, it petered out. The figures outside the fence were gone, but they hadn't been for long. I didn't see them leave because I was probably watching out one of the other windows. I woke up Jake because I wanted the help of a man to be on alert and defensive, because I thought they hadn't gone far yet. We had been good friends for a couple years. At that time, him and I had been growing closer romantically, but only for a bit more than a week. I swallowed my pride because now or never was the time for the truth, and said, "I love you." He said it back, and I was so relieved and happy. I racked my brain, and neither him nor I can think of any logical explanation other than a creature not yet known to science. He heard the scratching before he fell asleep, but at that point it wasn't alarming. He agreed that it was about 4 hours from when he fell asleep to when he woke up. The scratching never ceased for more than a minute or two during that time. On another night when he was camping with his friend, he heard aggressive, loud, and unexplainable noises of a much more dramatic nature, but this is a story for another time. Suffice to say, we believe there are cunning, hungry beasts with vocal, athletic, and sensory capabilities beyond imagination. These and other errant bizarre sounds remind us of stories of Wendigos. I dread to think, but the figures outside the fence I could have just been one, the shorter one being the hind legs and the taller one being the front. The top of the figures were in shadow. If that is the case, it could have been throwing its voice and creating the scratching noises itself. 3 creatures or 1. Theoretically, it could have been a rabid rat that just happened against all odds to stay out of sight, and I went into psychosis when I heard it all around me. But neither I nor my family has any history of hallucinations. I believe that I remain too composed to imagine such a thing. The figures could have been cops after him or robbers hiding out coincidentally at the exact time. I don't think so though. Thank God these creatures sensed that we were not to be trifled with and wouldn't go down without a fight. I used to be a scaredy cat about every noise at night. My mindset towards this and life in general has improved since then, because I realize I am capable of much more mental strength than I believed. Second story. This story was shared by Dark and Creepy. Never shoot a skinwalker. My 2 buddies and I went on a hunting trip for bull elk last November and we were having a great time, to say the least. That however soon would change after what we saw on the 3rd day. Now I'm not one for superstition and I don't believe in ghosts at all, but what we saw out there really changed my view about those sorts of things. The trip started out normally after we parked our trailers at camp. We got there a day early before the hunt officially started so we could settle in and get some scouting done. Only Eric and I had licenses because Brian didn't draw out this year, but he wanted to come along with us anyway. Brian also brought along his German Shepherd named Lucy, which stayed back at camp with a leash that was connected to a metal spike. The spike was so deep in the ground that I wondered if we would be able to get it out. I asked Brian and he just told me that his dog was so strong that it had to be that deep. I enjoyed playing with Lucy. She was always excited to see me and would greet me by jumping up on 2 legs and trying to lick my face. Eric, however, was not amused by her and would constantly yell at her to leave him alone. Anyway, the first 2 days we saw so many cow elk in valleys and on sides of the mountains, that I thought for sure we would see some bulls out there, but there were none among them. It wasn't until the 3rd day of the hunt that we saw a bull elk, but it was too far away to take a shot at. And even if we were able to hit it, it would take hours trying to pack that thing out. So that evening we decided to hunker down next to some fallen trees and were able to watch a hillside. While we were surveying the area, Brian spotted a coyote about 250 yards walking to a small pond of water strangely as if it was maimed. Eric took out his binoculars to take a closer look and he started to describe it, saying, "That coyote. It ain't right lookin'. It has a hunch on its back like a bear, and its jaw. Oh man, its damn jaw seems like it's been broken and now it's just drooping there like a dead fish. Let me see those binos, I asked curiously with an outstretched hand. Eric handed them to me, and as he did he seemed to grasp his gun tightly. I took them and looked at the animal and said, "You're right, that thing's jaw is just hanging there. Also, did you happen to notice its hair? It's so long and unevenly dispersed." I then handed the binoculars to Brian and he looked at the coyote for 1 second and screamed. "Shoo, Brian, shut up. We're hunting." Eric whispered harshly. "What did you see?" I asked as I looked at his shocked facial expression. Brian looked at his feet as he muttered, "I saw my dog Lucy, but it wasn't her. I don't know what that was. It couldn't have been your dog. When I looked at it, it looked like a dying coyote. It didn't have the large black spot on its back or your dog's strawberry red sides and underbelly." I said in a plain yet confused manner. "Well, since we ain't gonna see anything out here 'cause you screamed like a baby, I'm going to put that coyote out of its misery," Eric said angrily as he raised his rifle and looked through the scope. A large shot followed and we saw the animal drop down soon after. It was a clean kill and Eric was curious about seeing what was wrong with the animal up close, so he started getting ready to hike out. As he got his stuff together he said, "You probably just didn't get a good look at it, Brian. Your dog is fine." Brian stood up and as he brushed the dirt off but he replied, "I swear I saw my dog, but an evil demented version of it with human eyes, but you guys are probably right. There's no way she could have had the strength to yank out the metal stake holding her back at camp." "Well, let's go find out the truth about this animal," I said somewhat excitedly as I started walking toward the dead animal. It took us about half an hour to hike over to it and we lost sight of the animal's corpse as we had to pass through some trees. Once we finally got to the spot where the animal had dropped there was no corpse, just a puddle of blood. However, the blood was blackish and very dense. Eric observed the scene and started to scratch his head as he said, "I could have sworn I shot that thing straight through its heart. There's no way it could have just gotten back up and walked off." I had an eerie feeling about the whole situation and Brian was still afraid that it might have been his dog that got shot. Eric, however, noticed a trail of blood leading into a dark tree line. Without asking he started to follow it and he loaded his gun. As he did, me and Brian were both freaked out and just watched Eric as he went into the forest. He soon went out of sight and Brian and I could not leave him here, so we waited. I passed the time by taking a skinny stick and poking at the puddle of blood. It smelled terrible and the aroma hit me pretty hard, so much so that my stomach convulsed and I threw up. "You okay?" Brian asked as he put his hand on my back. Before I could answer there was a loud shot that echoed through the trees and we both looked at the direction it came from. "Must have found the animal," I said as I spit into the grass. As soon as I said this we could now see Eric, but he was full on sprinting. "Run!" he screamed as he ran at us. I noticed that he must have dropped his gun because he wasn't carrying it. I was about to ask him what happened, but Brian grabbed my arm and yanked me towards where we had parked the truck. Without hesitation, I ran. We soon made it back to the truck and my shoulder hurt from the rubbing of the gun strap. I looked back at Eric, who slowed down for nothing. I soon looked behind him and saw nothing chasing us. So I opened the truck and got in without worry. Eric then climbed in and told me to hit the gas and go. I was so perplexed on what Eric saw out there, and I knew that he hardly ever got scared of anything, so this started to freak me out. I started driving fast back to camp and I asked Eric, "What did you see out there that was scary enough to make you drop your gun?" "I don't know, man, that was no damn animal. I followed the trail of blood and it stopped at the base of a tree, and I was wondering how a coyote was able to climb a tree, but when I looked up I saw this hairy humanoid creature there. It smelled so freaking bad. Eric went on about how scary that thing was and how he was done with the hunting trip and wanted to go home. We soon pulled into camp and mutually decided that we were going home. I started to pack my things and then felt like something was missing. I then thought to myself, Lucy, where is Brian's dog? She usually always is so excited to see us back at camp she can't stop barking and whining to be set free. As soon as I thought this, Brian started screaming and crying. I ran over to where he was and saw that his dog was gone. However, on further inspection, I noticed what Brian was looking at. Something had pulled out the metal stake in the ground and strung Lucy up on a nearby tree and had skinned her. Brian just could not stop crying, and Eric ran over to see what was wrong and just stood there, jaw dropped and frozen. He then muttered, "She was skinned alive. There's a bunch of bruising caused by struggling around her neck where the collar is." "Shut up, Eric, you ain't helping," I said as I put my shoulder around Brian, who had unstrung his dog's body from the tree. "Skinwalker," Eric said in a low tone of voice as he looked into the distance. He then screamed, "It's a damn skinwalker." I followed his gaze and saw an animal that looked like Lucy, but it had human eyes and a sickly green glazed-looking coat of fur. Brian stopped crying and just stood there, eyes locked on the beast. Eric then whispered with his voice quivering, "We all run to the truck on a count of 3. Just leave everything else." Brian and I slowly nodded and agreed to the plan. "Okay, 3, 2, 1. Eric whispered sharply and we all took off like a pack of gazelles for the truck. We hopped in, and as soon as we did we saw the skinwalker lunge at us and struck the right side door with such a powerful blow that nearly tipped over the whole truck. It didn't stop me whatsoever, and I drove out of there faster than I ever could have. After that, none of us ever went hunting again in that area. We never even went back to claim our camping trailers and supplies. It was too terrifying to think that what happened to Brian's dog could happen to us, and that thing would walk around in our skin. Since that experience, I am now a superstitious person. Third story. This story was shared by Retsma-H6. Message from a Wendigo. I have been trapped here for too long. I can never forget the day I was taken. It was the dead of night. I had just killed my prey, a woman who had been foolish enough to wander into my home. I remember how happy I was that day, that I did not have to hunt, instead the food brought itself to me. If only I had known then, that my delight would soon turn into terror. The men came into my home and overpowered me. There were 3 of them. They were large, much larger than the normal men I hunted. Perhaps in different circumstances, would have killed and consumed them. But I was injured at the time. Not a grave injury, but it impeded me still. I had received the wound a week before, from a particularly resilient man. He had beat at my foot with a rock, damaging my ankle, even as I straddled his chest, tearing his throat open. Looking back, I still find myself appreciating the man's sheer will. But I appreciated his flesh much more. Even without the injury, the men would have been difficult to conquer. As I said, they were large, but not only that. They were carrying strange metal poles. They were warriors of some kind. The poles fired darts that struck me and made me drowsy. The men threw me into a metal carriage that moved by means I knew not, and still do not know. It was within this carriage I lost consciousness. I awoke, I know not when, in a metal cage. I was still in a slight daze. There were men all around, all just as large as the three who had attacked me. Initially, I was ecstatic. I was surrounded by food, and I did not see any of the men who had taken me. These ones did not have any metal poles, so they were easy prey. But when I attempted to escape, I found myself unable to damage the cage in any way. I shrieked and roared, and bashed at the cage. The men flinched in fear, and some pulled smaller metal objects from pouches at their hips. I drew myself to my full height, still towering above the men, despite them being larger than the ones I was accustomed to. I felt something hit me in my back, and I turned my head to see another dart had struck me. One of the men who had taken me had been behind me the whole time, on the other side of the cage, and he had fired another dart at me. Once again, I fell unconscious. When I awoke again, I was in a room. It was larger than the cage I had previously been, 10 paces wide and double across. But, this one did not offer the commodity of being able to see out of it. The walls were hard stone, and the door a harder metal. I tried to break out for hours, but I could not. I laid upon the ground, only thinking of my hunger. I was utterly ravenous. Whether it was morning, noon, or night, I had no way of knowing. All I knew was how famished I was. Even if only one day had passed since I had last eaten, it still would have been one day too many without food. My capture was, regrettably, my fault and mine alone. I had grown complacent. I was situated in a location with much prey, and I stayed for too long. I have lived for hundreds of years, and I have hunted in many places. I have preyed upon men of every color and creed. I have always hidden my tracks, and never stayed in one place for too long. But I was lulled into a false sense of security. My home, a deep cavern, was one I thought no man would find me in. I should have fled when that woman entered my home. If she could find her way in, of course warriors could. I curse my foolishness, but I must look forward. The past cannot be undone. All of this happened a while ago. I can only estimate the length of time that has passed. I assume it to be a fortnight. 1 fortnight, stuck in this prison. 1 fortnight too many. The men frequently take me from the room. They always do it the same way. A small part of the door is opened, and meat is thrown in. I devour it, for I am starving, always. I am rendered comatose moments afterwards. They have poisoned the food. In the brief seconds before I am unconscious, I can see the door open and men enter. I always awake in the same room, but in a different position from where I fainted. I know the men are taking me somewhere and returning me. I know not where they are taking me, nor what they are doing to me. The only way to avoid this would be not to eat the meat, and that is no option at all. My hunger will not allow it. Sometimes, the men try to speak to me. I can speak their simple language, of course. But I say nothing to them. I have no interest in doing so. Most of the time, the men leave me be. Sometimes, if I roar and bellow and strike at the walls too much, 5 men will enter the room, and hit me with darts. I have attempted to attack them, but their strength is shocking. I have grown weak since I arrived here. The men wrapped my injured foot in something. I am unsure of what it is, or what nefarious purpose it serves. I live in fear. I fear man. Man, whom I have preyed upon since I was created by the Great Spirit. Man, who have feared me, and indeed feared all Wendigos, now have made me feel fear. I fear their metal poles. I fear their size. I do not know why these ones are so big. A different tribe, perhaps. I am ashamed of myself for feeling this way. It is as if I am their pet. I often wonder where they get the meat from. It is man meat, without a doubt. They tried to feed me other things, but I can only consume man meat. These men must kill and butcher their own kind to get it. Perhaps they consume other men as well. I shudder at the depravity of it. The thought of killing, or even worse, consuming my own kind, other Wendigos, makes me sick. I don't know what the people will do to me. I have heard a story of a Wendigo that was slaughtered by men. They chopped off his legs, then later cut him to small pieces. I imagine they will do something similar to me. Today, when I awoke, I found paper in my room. So, I write this message. I write it in my native tongue, which only Wendigos know, and is simply nonsensical gibberish to humans. I have no way of knowing where this message will go, but it is my only option. If any of my kind somehow finds this, please save me. I will forever be in your debt. Dr. K. Bowman. The preceding transcript was written by a man named Ned Terrell. Canadian, 2.05 m tall, 34 years old. Worked as a dentist. Him and his girlfriend went missing 3 months and 4 days ago, and were presumed dead. Mr. Terrell lived a normal life prior to his disappearance. He received a proper education, was never abused, never had mental health issues, or any sort of violent behavior. All of his friends and family spoke of him quite highly, until they were informed of his actions. Those who knew Mr. Terrell noted that he had always been quite fascinated with superstitions, legends, and mythological creatures. On multiple occasions, he would go on trips to attempt to find these supernatural beings. He has traveled to Scotland to look for the Loch Ness Monster, America to find several creatures including Bigfoot and Mothman, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore to find a Pontianak, as well as several other countries. His most recent interest was the Wendigo. The Wendigo is a Native American legend, but is quite well known in Canada as well. It is somewhat surprising that Mr. Terrell never went looking for the Wendigo earlier than he did. The stories behind the Wendigo vary quite a fair amount. It is typically said to be a spirit that possesses humans and drives them to cannibalism, but it's also said to be its own individual creature which consumes human beings. Some sources also say that humans who resort to cannibalism to survive turn into Wendigos. Wendigos, despite often being depicted as anthropomorphic deer-like creatures, are actually traditionally described as giant humanoids that smell extremely foul, and can cause a chill, and in some iterations, a blizzard, wherever they go. Mr. Terrell went looking for the Wendigo on April the 6th. He went with his girlfriend, Iris Hall, 31. They went to Ontario, and explored deep into a forest that will remain unnamed. They informed their family and friends that they would be gone for at least a week, maybe a few days more. An extreme blizzard hit the area they were in, and their families were worried. After they still had not returned after 1 week and 5 days, they were reported as missing. After nearly a month of searching, they were not found, and were declared dead. 2 weeks after this, it was noted that several children were reported missing from towns near the forest. 20 children in 4 days. They found the bodies of several of the missing children, partially consumed. The worst was a 6-year-old boy, who I won't name out of respect for him and his family. I saw the body and, while I won't go into detail, I will note that the damage was so severe it was presumed that a bear had attacked him. Wildlife control was called in to reduce the animal population of any predators in the area. Well over 50 men were deployed and, over the course of the next couple of months, tranquilized and relocated dozens of wolves and bears. But the attacks never stopped, or even slowed. While almost all the missing people were children, a very small number of adults also disappeared. 3 to be precise. 2 men, both aged 23, and 1 woman, aged 21. It is worth noting that all the adults who disappeared were extremely small in stature, and could be mistaken for large children, as opposed to adults. Finally, 3 wildlife control rangers happened across a cave with several bodies surrounding it. They entered. Upon entering, they found Mr. Terrell. He was standing over the remains of a young girl, who has since been identified. She was 12, and was out for a hike when she passed by the cave and was taken. She lived about 2 hours away from the cave. Once again, I will not reveal her name. Due to Mr. Terrell recording everything he and his girlfriend did on the trip with an action camera, we know exactly what happened. The camera was found in the same cave as Mr. Terrell and there are several videos recovered. The severely decomposed body of Iris Hall was also found. The videos are as follows. Videos 1 to 13, all are simply videos of Terrell and Hall exploring the wilderness. They come across as very likable, good-natured, and simply looking for fun. They kiss a lot, laugh a lot, and really love one another. In videos 8, 9, and 12, they speak about marriage and children. Video 14, after about a week of exploring, Terrell and Hall are ready to head back to civilization. Unfortunately, one of the worst blizzards in history occurred on that day. It would last for several weeks. Weather reports cite the temperature as dropping to 33 degrees Celsius. They took shelter in a cave. They are still extremely upbeat, and perfectly composed. They had camping equipment, and still had enough supplies for another few days. They make a few jokes, set up a small camp slightly far away from the mouth of the cave, then turn the camera off. Video 15, a video of Terrell and Hall exploring the cave. It is quite large. Terrell mentions the Wendigo, and says it might be in there with them. He says that the cannibalism aspect of the Wendigo is what disturbs him the most, and that the very thought of it makes him somewhat nauseous. Hall questions how a human could sink to such depths. The video cuts off abruptly for no reason. Presumably a malfunction. Video 16, another video of the duo exploring the cave. Iris suddenly slips and screams. Terrell rushes towards her. He carries her back to the camp. He pulls the camera off his head. It ends up face down in the dirt. The video lasts for several hours before turning off, presumably due to the camera running out of battery. Video 17, Terrell facing the camera. He is noticeably upset. He remarks that Hall's leg is severely injured, the blizzard still going on, and their food is gone. He says he doesn't recall eating any, and Iris doesn't either. He stares blankly at something off-screen for several seconds, then turns the camera off. Video 18, a goodbye video from Terrell and a barely conscious Hall. Only the upper half of Hall can be seen, due to the lower half of her being covered by a blanket. It is impossible to know the extent of the injury she suffered from. Given how much blood is on the blanket, it can only be assumed it is very severe. The two genuinely think they are going to die. Video 19, another video with Terrell facing the camera. He is scarily thin now. Skin like paper, sunken cheeks, blank expression. He says the blizzard has been going on for a long time, and shows no signs of stopping. He remarks that he is starving to death. He talks about the Wendigo, and mutters something under his breath. The word cannibalism is barely audible. Once again, he looks at something off camera. He turns the video off. Video 19 is the final video. But we can easily deduce what happens. Left with no choice, Mr. Terrell cannibalizes Iris Hall. He has a psychotic breakdown. He cannot live with being a cannibal, and to save himself, convinces himself that he is not a cannibal, he is a Wendigo, and eating humans is simply something he must do. The blizzard ends approximately 6 hours after this. Terrell begins his murder spree. I would now like to cross-reference the story Mr. Terrell wrote with facts that actually occurred. The note was written in French, Mr. Terrell's first language. Firstly, he calls the people he killed, men and women, despite them all being children. He also said that the men who took him were much larger than the ones he normally hunted. Of course, this is due to the former being adults. He may have done this to lessen his guilt. He hunted exclusively children due to how easy they are to capture. Upon finding Mr. Terrell, the Rangers panicked and tranquilized Mr. Terrell. Despite being injected with enough tranquilizer to kill an average male, he survived. They threw him into a truck meant for animals, and immediately drove to the nearest police station. He was placed in a holding cell. When he awoke, he attacked the bars of the cell. One wildlife control ranger was still present to give a statement to the police. He still had his tranq rifle with him, and shot Mr. Terrell yet again, due to the panic he was in. He was not charged for anything, as it was a rather understandable reaction. After the holding cell, Mr. Terrell was later transferred directly to our mental facility, and is currently locked in a room just down the hall. The process of getting him in here was a little scuffed, but we made it happen. We had to. He is without a doubt the most dangerous patient I've ever seen, but also the most fascinating. We feed him exclusively pork, as he spits out anything else we give him. I find it rather interesting that Mr. Terrell called the tranq rifles metal poles, and the truck a metal carriage. Without a doubt he knows what guns and trucks are. He seems to feign ignorance about many things. For instance, not knowing how much time has passed. There is a clock in his room. This shows how far his delusion goes. He has convinced himself that he knows nothing about human technology. Why would he? He's a Wendigo. He also said that he had a foot injury from being hit with a rock. While he did have a hairline fracture, it was nothing major. We gave him a cast. He doesn't seem very fond of it. We do frequently remove Mr. Terrell from his room, but only so we can clean him. He won't do it himself, even though his room has a bathroom. Not to mention, we have to treat his infections and injuries. Living in a cave and eating people for a couple of months is not good for you. As for the sheet of paper he wrote on, I had it placed in his room today. Why? Sometimes, people write down exactly what's wrong with them. Terrell will stay locked up for the rest of his life, and probably die still thinking he's a Wendigo. Nothing anyone has said or done can convince him otherwise. Myself, other doctors, and his friends and family. At least, the few friends and family still willing to see him. Terrell doesn't respond to anything we say. He's pretending not to understand us. We have come to the end of the story of Ned Terrell. Well, maybe not quite. He's already turned into an urban legend, and someday someone will probably make one of those serial killer documentaries about him, and after that a horror movie that'll say, based on true events. It'll probably be called The Canadian Cannibal, or something equally as tasteless. Another thing, Terrell is not entirely unique. Wendigo psychosis, a condition which causes humans to resort to cannibalism, has been observed before. To my knowledge, however, no case of it has ever been officially studied. I believe Terrell will be the first. Although we should probably rename the ailment to Terrell's disorder, or something along those lines. He is simply an insane man, that is all. Certainly not possessed by an evil spirit of any kind. I mean, come on. Wendigos. There's no such thing. Now if you'll excuse me, I must shut my windows. The temperature just took an absolute dive. It's rather chilly now. I think there's a blizzard coming in. Fourth story. This story was shared by morbid_tales_. Don't tell skinwalker stories around the campfire. I was camping in Arizona with my cousin. We built a fire, then got some marshmallows out to make some s'mores. It was a warm night, but we were having a good time. I hadn't gone camping with my cousin in years, since we were teenagers. I blew the flame out on my marshmallow, and crushed it between 2 graham crackers, and chocolate. Do you want to hear a scary story? My cousin asked with a sly grin on his face. When we were younger, he used to always tell scary stories around the fire. I couldn't help but get excited. Let's see if you still got it. I said with my own grin. Have you ever heard of a skinwalker? He asked, popping a marshmallow in his mouth. Yeah, isn't it a native legend? Something about turning into a coyote? Yes, a skinwalker is a Navajo witch that wears the skins of animals, and can turn into any animal they want. He leans in closer so the fire illuminates his face. What's so scary about that? I ask. You don't want to run into one of them. Trust me, I have. I say nothing, waiting for him to continue on with the story. I was visiting my friend on the res one day the summer after graduation. We were hanging out on the porch, talking about what we were gonna do now that school was over. Just wasting the night away, you know. Then I noticed a coyote just wandering around a few yards away. Now in this neighborhood there weren't any fences dividing the yards, so I could see it walk from yard to yard. I nudged my friend and nodded over to it. We got quiet and just watched it. Then it stood up on 2 feet. It was pressed up against a house in the shadows and just scooted along on 2 feet like a human. I was so shocked. I didn't think coyotes could do that. My friend whispered to me, "That's no coyote." I asked him what he meant. That's a skinwalker. Now he had mentioned skinwalkers to me before, but I thought it was just a legend, and that he surely didn't believe some old story his parents told him to scare him from playing in the woods at night. Once it was next to a garbage can, it hopped on top of it, then leaped up, grabbing on to the window ledge. The window was open. Fear filled my body as I realized 2 things. No coyote could do that. And whoever was in that room was about to have a very bad night. Then we heard the guy in that room screaming, then his screams were drowned out by a scream that was somewhat of a mix of animal and human. We fell out of our chairs scrambling to get inside. We locked all the doors and windows and hid. That was the scariest night of my life. I don't remember if cops showed up to that house. We were too scared to leave the room and check. But it's a night I'll never forget. Goosebumps cover my arms. Now that was a good story. I didn't believe him about it being true, but it was a good story nonetheless. Looks like you still got it, that was good. Got me being scared to look into the trees. I laughed nervously looking behind me at the forest that seems just a little scarier now. Hey, every word of that is true. I didn't make this one up. No need to make up a scary story when you've lived it. He has a pleased look on his face nonetheless. We sat in silence for a bit and I thought about the story he just told. For some reason a coyote creeping around on two legs just seems comical. I laughed to myself. Maybe it would be creepier in person. After another 30 minutes, the fire dies down and we crawl into our tent. All thoughts of skinwalkers had left our heads. I was drifting off to sleep when a stick snapping outside our tent woke me up. My face was facing the wall of the tent and I don't think I'd quite registered what woke me up. After a few seconds I closed my eyes and prepared to go back to sleep. Then I heard my cousin outside the tent calling my name. I opened my eyes. I assumed my cousin had stepped outside for some reason, but I didn't know what he would need me for out there. I didn't quite want to leave my sleeping bag, so I was just gonna pretend like I didn't hear him. I closed my eyes again. Then I heard him call me again. Annoyed, I sat up to leave the tent. That's when I noticed my cousin right next to me. Asleep. I knew I heard him call me from outside the tent. I heard it twice. There was no mistake. I shook him awake. What do you want? He asked groggily, not opening his eyes. I heard your voice outside the tent calling my name. Am I going crazy? He opens his eyes, a panicked look in his eyes. You're absolutely sure? My voice? He asks. Yeah. Twice. There was no mistaking it. He pulls me down to the ground next to him. We hear some shuffling outside the tent. I start to freak out a little. That's a skinwalker. They can imitate voices. That's how they draw you in. He whispers. A skinwalker? Are you sure? What's the odds of a skinwalker showing up the same night you tell me the story? Don't mess with me. I whisper back. Talking about a skinwalker at night can draw it to you. I didn't think about that when I told the story. Just stay quiet and stay down and hopefully it will leave. The sound of another stick snapping didn't help at all. After a few long frightful hours of laying their eyes wide open, it seemed to go away. Eventually, I fell asleep, I guess. I don't remember falling asleep, and don't know how I could. My cousin was already packing everything up by the time I crawled out of the tent. I know we planned for 2 more nights, but we're getting out of here right now. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I said. Now I can't say for sure it was a skinwalker that night. But I can say I definitely heard my cousin calling my name from outside the tent when he was sleeping right next to me. And that was by far the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. So take my advice and save the skinwalker stories for when you're safe in the comforts of home and not for the campfire. Fifth story. This story was shared by AltBallsDeep. Don't go to the ghost town inn. One late summer day, my old Uncle Greg called to tell me his sister had suffered from cardiac arrest. The news of my aunt's passing would send me off on a cross-country road trip while my wife stayed home to look after the dog and cats. Sarah protested at first, saying she wanted to be there for emotional support. But, this wasn't my first funeral procession, and truth be told, I was never close to my aunt. I was just going to be there for Greg. So after convincing Sarah to just stay home and spend the week relaxing, I was off on my road trip. Little did I know what I'd be getting into. My first day cruising the interstate went off without a hitch. Despite the sullen nature of the journey, getting out and seeing the open countryside of multiple different states made my spirit feel lightweight and free of life's day-to-day grind. I'd end the first day by pulling into a cozy little town, stopping at a small mom and pop diner before checking in at a nearby motel. Day 2 seemed a little more hectic. Waking up late, I rushed out of the hotel and hit the road. Opting to skip breakfast entirely, I spent the better half of 8 hours driving 10 over the speed limit, stopping only to get gas. Sleeping in had put me 4 hours behind schedule, and come nightfall, I found myself on a long stretch of highway snaking through mountainous woodlands. My eyes drifted between the road and the digital clock on the dashboard. After 12 straight hours of driving, I was cursing under my breath and looking for anywhere to stop for the night. When the woods surrounding the highway became so thick that it began to block out the natural moonlight, I sighed and came to the conclusion I might be pulling over to sleep in my car. To my surprise, a sign popped up, indicating an exit for a town. Twinsgrove, population 700. All the tension left my body and in an instant I became more relaxed. The exit took me down a winding canyon road, made unnerving by the lack of guard rails and low-hanging tree branches that seemed to reach out for my windshield. Finally, it dumped off into a flat forested area, which I thought vacant at first. After a moment of driving, I noticed the houses buried deep in the tree-line. The driveways leading to the houses were gravel and well hidden between the trees. From what I could make out with the brief passing of my car's headlights, the houses appeared quite old, weathered and worn down. One sat closer to the road, and I could clearly see the doors and windows boarded up. I had been driving through this town for all but 5 minutes and already it was creeping me out. Just when I began to consider turning around, the dull glow of a gas station appeared in the distance. Knowing I'd need to fuel up to reach the next major town, I decided to pull in alongside one of the pumps. Figured I'd ask the clerk inside if there were any places I could stay for the night while I was there. I stepped out of my car, embracing the unusually cold air which sent shivers down my spine. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my wallet only to realize the pumps were so old that they didn't take any form of card payment. Shrugging it off, I walked into the store, only to find it empty. Literally empty. The entire building was just an open room, no shelves or freezers for storing goods. A gross checkered tile with numerous stains and cracks dominated the room, accentuated by a flickering light in the back right corner. I stared at the surreal and vacant store in front of me, only snapping back to reality when I saw a roach scurrying across the floor. Feeling thoroughly unnerved by the situation, I returned to my car and contemplated my next move. It was damn near midnight now, and I needed to get some shut-eye. Against my better judgment, I pulled out of the parking lot and headed further up the road. Not even a mile up the road, an old wooden sign came up for a roadside inn. With crossed fingers, I pulled into the lot. My headlights illuminated a two-story log cabin-style cottage nestled between thickets of trees. Moss or ivy appeared to be growing on the outer walls, and all of the windows were dark except for one, which had a faint glow. An uneasy feeling washed over me once I turned the car off. I spent another minute debating if I really wanted to approach that building, which didn't have a single source of light besides the faint glow from the first-floor window. Stepping out into the night air, it immediately struck me how eerily silent my surroundings seemed to be. After many camping trips in the mountains and forests, I had grown accustomed to the nocturnal sounds of the wilderness. Owls, crickets, the call of coyotes or foxes. The area around this cabin was dead quiet. Not even the slightest rustling of trees or bushes could be heard. Listening to my own footsteps while approaching the inn made the very hairs on my back stand up. The door to the cabin had an old, rusting metal sign which read "Open" nailed above the door handle. I spent another few seconds just staring at the sign, wondering if I should knock or just step inside. Out of nowhere, a rush of hot air ran down my neck with a distinct sensation which can only be described as someone standing right behind me and letting out a deep breath. I spun around, heart now racing from what I just felt, but nobody was there. Chalking it up to a lack of sleep, I turned around and nearly screamed when the face of an old man stood just inches away. He somehow managed to open the door and positioned himself in the doorway without making even the slightest sound. The man wore brown dress pants and a brown tweed jacket. Wrinkles lined his scowling face, which sat under a messy mop of scraggly gray hair. "What are ye doin' out this time of night?" His voice barked in the silence of the night, filled with rasp and old age. Holding my still beating heart, I drew in a deep breath and closed my eyes. "Looking for a place to stay for the night, sir?" His eyes narrowed, nearly hiding his hazy green irises. After turning and grumbling, the old man gestured me to follow him inside. "Only one vacant room, top floor. It's $50 a night." We walked into a dim lobby, lit by candles and decorated with antiques from a bygone time. The old man stepped behind a counter which held various dusty books and old glass bottles. I pulled out my wallet and offered him my card. He took it, shaking his head and letting out a sigh. "Only take cash, son. But, I tell you what, you can stay fair tonight and pay me back later." He handed my card back and reached down under the desk to grab an old brass key. A grateful smile fell upon my face. "Man, I can't thank you enough," I dashed. Before I could finish, he cut me off. No need to thank me, it's been a good while since I've had a guest come to stay." He paused, leaned in, and displayed a crooked smile. "I'm happy to accommodate you, son. Take a candle here to light your way." Standing there somewhat speechless, I grabbed the key from him along with one of the candles. I looked down and saw the room number etched into the face of the key. Room 13. The old man continued to show his unflattering smile as I nodded my head and turned to the hallway. Against the dim glow of candlelight, I saw a row of vintage photographs lining the wall. The people in them were dressed from the Victorian era. Walking down the old creaking floorboards, I saw the hallway split into two paths. On the right was the staircase to the second floor. To the left sat the intersection of another hallway, with the vague outline of a deer head mounted on the wall. I stared at that mounted head as I approached the staircase, unnerved by the frightened expression it wore on its frozen dead face. Just when I began to climb the flight of stairs, I saw that fucking deer head move in the peripheral of my vision. Frozen on the steps, I slowly turned around and peeked over the low wall which separated the hallway divide. The deer head looked straight on down the hall, a vacant stare in its beady eyes. "Okay, I'm really fucking tired, I need to get some sleep," I whispered. Making my way to the top of the staircase, I tiptoed through the halls looking for room 13, all while keeping my head on a swivel. My room ended up being at the very back of the hallway. Slotting the key into the doorknob, I stopped and turned around when I heard something behind me. It sounded like a group of people whispering something unintelligible, just out of earshot. But there wasn't anything there in the hallway behind me, just those vintage photographs sitting above burgundy carpets on brown floral wallpaper. Shaking my head, I quickly unlocked the door and pushed my way inside. The room I stepped into seemed cramped. A double bed with a wooden frame sat against the wall, facing a lone window which revealed only tree branches on the other side. 2 end tables accompanied the bed on each side, with a small attached bathroom at the foot of the bed. That was the extent of the room, but I didn't spend any time thinking or complaining about the dimensions. Setting the candle down on the end table, I tucked myself in and closed my eyes. Sleep did not come. Almost in an act of defiance, the room became unsettling and noisy the moment I closed my eyes. Branches hit the wall outside the window, creaks from the floorboards echoed beyond the closed door, and a faint scratching sound emanated from the bathroom. Completely frustrated, I got up to investigate the scratching sound, but found nothing. The sound disappeared the moment I stepped foot into the bathroom, only to flare up again when I laid back down. Soon, even the sound of the candle became unbearable, keeping me awake with the crackling and burning wick. In a fit of irrational thinking, I blew out the candle and tucked my head between 2 pillows. A cold chill then swept over me and I opened my eyes. That's when I saw it. Perched on the ceiling, obscured by shadows of the night, was a distorted human face. Frozen in fear, I sat there and watched this face as it slowly moved across the ceiling, shifting its facial expressions in horrifying and inhuman ways. The thing looked like it was in constant agony. Once it hovered directly above me, I heard faint whispering coming from its mouth, the very same whispering I heard in the hallway earlier. Ice ran through my veins when this shadowy face began to descend from the ceiling, heading right for me. Taking control of my body, I let out a piercing scream and jolted out of bed. Crashing through the door, I ran down the hallway. Time slowed as my heart blasted in my chest. Hundreds of those faces began materializing in the very walls, slowly floating out in my direction. No, 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 fuck this, fuck all of this, it can't be real. My screams only seemed to anger the shadow entities, which now lunged out of the walls with glowing red eyes. Making a sharp turn, I bolted down the staircase, my feet crashing down loudly with each step. When I reached the bottom, I froze in horror. Blocking the hallway ahead stood a shadow figure 10 feet tall. It had a rotting deer skull for a head with piercing red eyes. Horrible demonic whispering radiated from the creature as it lurched forward. Booking it back up the staircase, I ran down the hallway opposite of room 13 until I hit a dead end with a single window. Turning to see that fucking Wendigo-esque beast hot on my trail, I made the decision to jump out of the fucking window. I landed hard into a thick blanket of bushes below, twisting my ankle in the process. Quickly getting to my feet, I hopped out of the bushes and looked up at the window. A pair of red eyes locked with mine, no body to be seen. The eyes slowly backed off and disappeared into the darkness. Frantic, I ran through the thick foliage and back into the parking lot, where I thanked God to see and sit in my car. I booked it out of that town and drove all night back up the highway until sunrise. Greg said I looked like mulled over shit when I arrived for the funeral, and I wasn't able to offer the emotional support I wanted to give him. I took a different route entirely on the way back home, never even wanting to see the sign for that God-forsaken town again. The thing that bothers me, though, is that when I go back to look on Google Maps, Twinsgrove isn't there. Doesn't even show up on old paper maps. Where the fuck did I go that night? Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.